Sociology Robot. Hello and welcome to the fourth video lecture for OCR A Level Sociology, Paper 1, looking at Marxism and Culture. In the last lecture, we looked at functionalism, and we can now understand functionalism as a consensus theory that puts a lot of importance on value consensus in society. Now, Marxism is a conflict theory. It rejects the idea that society is based around our biological needs that we all share in common, or shared values. Instead, Marxism says there is conflict going on in society, and this is a conflict between groups with different economic interests. Marxism makes an assumption about culture that it has a materialist basis, that the base of any culture or society is the available resources. That includes things like food and water, fuel, technology, and of course, who controls those resources. The superstructure is all the cultural institutions built on or shaped by that base. This means that underlying all the things about our culture, the festivals, the art, religion, politics, family structure, food, dress, language, all boils down to a set of economic arrangements about who has got control of the most important physical resources. Now, Marxists term these the means of production. Farms produce food, so the means of production of food is farming. And mines produce coal, and oil rigs produce oil, and factories produce our manufactured goods. And the big question that Marxists ask is, who owns the farms, mines, and factories? Who controls the means of production? Marxists point out that there are fundamentally just two groups of people in society. We can call these classes. There is the ruling class, who control the means of production. That's quite a small class, but it's an incredibly powerful and influential one. Marx himself uses the term bourgeoisie. It's a little bit of an old-fashioned expression now, but sociologists still use it, and so should you. Then there is everybody else, the working class. These are people who don't control the means of production, so they have to labour, they have to work, and they have to sell their labour to the ruling class in exchange for getting a wage. That's the only way they can support themselves. Marx terms the working class the proletariat. Now, this arrangement with the ruling class owning and controlling everything of any importance and the working class having to work for the ruling class is, of course, unfair. And it's exploitative. The ruling class doesn't pay the workers what they deserve. They pay them less than their labour is worth because they want to make a profit. Marxism supports broadly the idea of cultural relativism. It doesn't accept that we all have biological needs that shape society. Instead, it thinks societies are all shaped by their economic base. And of course, the economic base differs. Some societies are in parts of the world where there's a huge amount of valuable resources which they can get access to and use. Other societies are in parts of the world which don't have these resources, or else they can't get at these resources. And this is going to mean that some cultures are more unfair and more unequal than others. And Marxists have an idea about what type of culture is the most unfair and unequal, and that is capitalism. Capitalism boils down to the idea of private ownership, that everything is owned by somebody, and that nothing is automatically free. And tied into this idea of private ownership is the idea of profit. Things are made and sold not for what they're worth, but at a price that makes a profit for the owner. It produces a small number of people who are stupendously rich, and the majority work hard in jobs that perhaps they would never choose to do if they didn't have to earn a wage. Advertising makes people feel that money and buying things is all that matters. Now, I've painted a very bleak picture of capitalism there, and it's only fair to point out that capitalism certainly has its strengths. Capitalism is efficient. If what you're interested in is making money and making a profit, then you don't want waste. Capitalism is creative. If you want to make money and make a profit, you've always got to come up with new ways of offering people stuff that they will pay for. And capitalism has produced an awful lot of progress. It's led to inventions like the internet, vaccines, incredible technology, medicine, and of course, artistic and creative projects. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at the idea of Western liberal democracies that are so beloved by functionalists. Marxists take a very different view on Western liberal democracies. They argue that these societies have come about because of the Industrial Revolution that began in Britain in the 1700s and spread throughout Europe and North America and onto the rest of the world. This has produced societies which are highly unequal, with a huge gap between the rich and the poor. But the technological power that the Industrial Revolution gave these societies enabled them to dominate other cultures. This produced imperialism, where countries go beyond their borders to dominate other peoples elsewhere in the world, and colonialism, which involves taking over another country and running it from afar. Think about the British Empire in the 1800s, which managed huge swathes of land and millions of people in other continents, and made British people very wealthy and very powerful. Now, what keeps this unequal and exploitative arrangement going? Marxists draw attention to the importance of ideology. Ideology is a set of ideas, and the purpose of ideology is to hide unfairness so that people don't notice it, and to justify unfairness so that even when people do notice it, they think it's okay. Ideology is spread by the media that puts misleading ideas into people's heads, through education that indoctrinates young people to believe that their society is fair and acceptable, and religion that also suggests that things are the way they are because perhaps God wants it to be that way. Now, what Marxists hope for is that people will arrive at a state called class consciousness. This is the realization that you are being oppressed. Once people have achieved class consciousness, they will realize that they're all in the working class together, they're being taken advantage of, and they'll unite against the ruling class. But that hasn't happened, or at least it hasn't happened here. Why is that? Marxists would suggest that there is another force going on, powered by ideology, called false consciousness. It's a type of brainwashing. False consciousness makes you believe that you benefit from capitalism. And it makes you think that the ruling class is on your side. You think the police are there to protect you, when Marxists would say they're really there to keep you in line. And you think that the government is there to serve you, whereas Marxists would say the government is really there to oppress you. And you think the media is telling you the truth, whereas Marxists would say the media is lying to you. Related to all of this is the Marxist idea of alienation. If you are a member of the working class living in a capitalist society, then your work is automatically going to be something you wouldn't want it to be. You won't see the benefit of your work. Whatever you're making, you won't be able to take it home with you. You are being paid a wage by somebody else, and everything you do is for their benefit, not yours. You are alienated from your labour. You're also alienated from yourself because you're not living your best life. With functionalism, we looked at the idea of social progress over time, and functionalists would point out that many evil and corrupt practices like slavery have been abolished. Marxists would not be so sure of that. They would say that black people are oppressed today just as they were in the past. Similarly, functionalists would say we no longer burn witches. But Marxists might point out that women are still very much second-class citizens, often confined to the home and housework. After all, what do witches and housewives have in common? They both use brooms. Functionalists would point out that we no longer have the divine right of kings. But Marxists would say those kings have just been replaced by super-wealthy capitalists like Mr. Monopoly there. This is why Marxists would say that a revolution is not something to be avoided, it's something to be embraced. Capitalism needs to be swept away and replaced by something radically different. Let's look at some key scholars for Marxism. And of course we start with Karl Marx himself, one of the big three sociologists, along with Durkheim and Weber, and the founder of Marxism. Karl Marx's book, with Friedrich Engels' The Communist Manifesto, sets out his main ideas. It ends with the very powerful call, "Workers of the world, unite," a slogan that's also written on Marx's gravestone in Highgate Cemetery in London. Marx went on to write a huge book, Capital, in which he sets out the economic basis for Marxism and his recommendation that communism would be a much better arrangement for people to live under. Communist society as opposed to a capitalist society, there is no private property. Everyone is equal. Everyone is paid the same. A number of countries have tried communism. The old USSR, Cuba, China. Has it ever worked? Well, it's had pretty doubtful success. Has it ever really been tried properly? A more recent Marxist sociologist is Jock Young, 20th century British researcher whose focus was on crime and law and order. Jock Young wrote What's to be Done About Law and Order in 1984. And he puts forward the interesting idea of a bulimic society. Now, bulimia is an eating disorder in which people crave food and then purge themselves, perhaps by throwing up afterwards. Young thinks that that's a great metaphor for our society, where everybody is hungry for new consumer goods, but as soon as we've got them, we discard them, because we now want the latest, more fashionable version. This leads to a state of constant frustration, intense envy towards people who've got more than you, and anger. Ultimately, it leads to crime. Young argues that capitalism itself produces or gives birth to crime. Ultimately, capitalism is criminal. How can we evaluate Marxism? A big strength of Marxism, as Karl Marx himself recognised, is that it is an activist perspective. It doesn't just want to understand society, it wants to change it. Marxist sociologists identify corruption, unfairness and exploitation. They argue for social change. This is very different from functionalists who tend to defend the status quo. A big weakness of Marxism, though, would be that it has been refuted by history. Many of Marx's predictions about the collapse of capitalism have not come true. Regimes inspired by Marxism have not been paradises, and they've been, for the most part, corrupt, violent, and ultimately failures. Of course, it's possible that these regimes, like for example the old USSR or the current People's Republic of China, have distorted Marxist ideas. They are not really representative of what Marx was recommending. And it's also a question worth considering about whether these regimes are in fact worse than capitalism. In summary, Marxism takes an economic basis for human behaviour. It thinks that wealth and money explains culture. It sees society as a conflict between the ruling class and the working class, and the working class are kept in line through ideology, which promotes a state of false consciousness, making them go along with the inequality and exploitation in society. If that ideology can be exposed, then perhaps the working class will arrive at class consciousness, and they'll see what's really going on. Until then, they're stuck in a state of alienation. Marxism is intensely critical of traditional institutions like religion and family. Let's have a look at some possible exam questions involving Marxism. A direct question about Marxism is unlikely in Section A of this paper, but Marxism could come up in your answer. For example, we looked at the question, outline and briefly evaluate the view that culture is changing in modern Britain. Marxists, of course, would say that culture will not change greatly because the ruling class want to keep things the way they are. There is a status quo. When change does happen, it would need to be revolutionary change. Another question we looked at is to outline and briefly evaluate the view that cultural relativism is helpful for understanding society. Marxism would evaluate this by agreeing when we look at other cultures and how different they are, that helps us see through our culture. And it's important to see through our culture because our culture, of course, as far as Marxists are concerned, is full of ideology, keeping us in a state of false consciousness. If you can broaden your mind and take a step back from your own culture, you're more likely to arrive at class consciousness and see things as they really are. Another question was, outline and briefly evaluate the view that norms in British society are changing. Marxists, again, will disagree that the ruling class are going to let norms change too much, and because of ideology and false consciousness, most norms will keep people firmly in their place. For example, in British society, there's a very strong norm not to complain about things. And these norms mean that the working classes in Britain are perhaps less likely to rebel, more likely to do as they're told by the ruling classes. The final question, outline and briefly evaluate the view that values in British society are shared by most people. This is something that Marxism would definitely disagree with. Marxists think that the values in British society are ruling class values. They're the values the ruling class want us to have. And these values are passed on through ideology. And if we accept these values, we're living in a state of false consciousness. I hope that's been a valuable introduction to Marxism for sociology. If you want to find out more, I've got a study guide, Socialisation, Culture and Identity, available from Amazon, and a combined study guide, Socialisation, Culture and Identity with Youth Subcultures, and you can find the links in the description below. Sociology Robot.